March 30th, 1945. Heidelberg, Germany. Good Friday. A 23-year-old woman named Ingrid presses her face against the cracked glass of a second-floor window on Rohrbacher Strasse. Her hands are shaking. Not from the cold. March has been mild this year, but from what she is watching unfold on the cobblestones below. American soldiers, hundreds of them, marching into her city without firing a single bullet. But that is not what makes her hands tremble. What makes her hands tremble is the scene playing out near the fountain at the corner. A GI, tall, clean-shaven, wearing a uniform that looks like it came off a department store rack, is kneeling down in front of a group of German children. He reaches into his jacket and pulls out something small, wrapped in brown paper, a Hershey bar. The children stare at it like it is a grenade. For 6 years, Joseph Goebbels had warned them. The Americans will poison you. The Americans will murder your families. The Americans are subhuman barbarians who will burn your cities to ash. But this American is smiling, and the chocolate is real, and one by one, the children reach for it. And one by one, they begin to laugh. Some of them are laughing for the first time in months. Ingrid picks up her fountain pen and writes a single line in her journal. A line that, if discovered by the retreating Wehrmacht officers still lurking in the hills above the city, would earn her immediate arrest. Maybe worse, she writes. The Americans are nothing like what they told us. They have chocolate, real chocolate, and they smile at children. 6 years of propaganda, erased by a Hershey bar and a grin. She has no idea, none whatsoever, that this moment, this single interaction between a soldier with chocolate and children who had forgotten what laughter sounded like, is the opening scene of one of the most extraordinary social transformations of the 20th century. A transformation that will produce more than 14,000 marriages between former enemies. A transformation that will create 37,000 children caught between two worlds. A transformation that will turn desperate, starving women into American citizens and turn the mightiest military occupation in history into the strangest love story ever told. But before the love comes, the hunger. Before the marriages come the regulations that forbid them. Before the families come the impossible choices that no human being should ever have to make. And to understand how 20,000 German women ended up crossing an ocean to build lives in a country that, just months earlier, had been dropping bombs on their homes, we need to go back. Back to the moment the American war machine rolled into Germany and collided, not with an enemy army, but with millions of women who had been left behind to survive in the ruins. This is not a romance. This is a forensic examination of what happens when the world's wealthiest army occupies a nation of starving women, when military regulations collide with human nature, when chocolate becomes currency, dancing becomes survival, and love becomes the most dangerous act of defiance either side could commit. The numbers are staggering. The personal stories behind those numbers are heartbreaking. And the legacy, still alive in millions of families today, is something no history book has properly told until now. Part 1. The Collision. When abundance met ruins. To understand what happened between American soldiers and German women after the war, you first have to understand one number, 4,000. That is the number of calories an American GI consumed every single day during the occupation of Germany. 4,000 calories. Bacon and eggs for breakfast, canned beef for lunch, steak, potatoes, bread, butter, coffee, and dessert for dinner, plus snacks, plus chocolate, plus chewing gum, plus cigarettes, which were not food, but in post-war Germany, they were worth more than food. We will get to that. Now here is the other number, 700. That is the number of calories most German civilians were actually consuming per day during the worst months of the occupation. Not the official ration. The official ration in the American zone was set at 1,550 calories. But most Germans never saw anything close to that number. In cities like Essen, in the industrial Ruhr, the actual calories reaching people's plates dropped to somewhere around 700. In some weeks, it was less. Let me put those two numbers next to each other for you, because the gap between them is the engine that drives everything that comes next. An American private eating 4,000 calories a day. A German mother eating 700. The American throws away more food after a single meal than that mother will see in an entire week. Now imagine those two people living on the same street. That is occupied Germany. And that calorie gap is not just a number on a nutritionist's chart. It is the engine that will drive everything. The romances, the heartbreaks, the marriages, the abandoned children, the impossible moral calculations, everything that follows in this story. Why am I starting with calories and not with love stories? Because you cannot understand the love stories without understanding the hunger. You cannot judge the choices these women made without first understanding that those choices were being made on empty stomachs. The scale of the American presence was unlike anything the world had ever seen. When the war ended in May 1945, there were 1.6 million American soldiers on German soil. Think about that. 1.6 million young men, most of them between the ages of 18 and 25, carrying with them the full industrial output of the richest nation on earth. The logistics alone boggle the mind. The 12th Army Group, just one segment of the American force, consisted of 1.3 million men, supported by 460,000 vehicles, consuming 1.25 million gallons of gasoline every single day. Each American Infantry Division had more trucks than entire German Army corps had possessed at the peak of Hitler's power. The Dental Corps alone, the guys who cleaned soldiers' teeth, employed more dentists than existed in the entire German state of Bavaria. And what did these soldiers find when they rolled into German cities? Ruins. 80% of central Berlin was destroyed. Hamburg had lost half its housing stock. Cologne's medieval center was unrecognizable rubble. Frankfurt, Mannheim, Nuremberg, Dresden, the list goes on. Germany's cities looked like the surface of the moon. Mountains of brick and twisted steel where neighborhoods used to be. Craters where parks and playgrounds had once stood. And among those ruins, picking through the wreckage with their bare hands, were women. Here is a statistic that changes everything about how you understand occupied Germany. Of Germany's male population aged 15 to 50, the working-age men, 4.8 million were dead. 11 million were sitting in prisoner-of-war camps, scattered across Europe and the Soviet Union. Millions more were disabled, missing limbs, blind, shell-shocked beyond recovery. In Berlin alone, women outnumbered men by a ratio of roughly 2 to 1. In some neighborhoods, it was worse. Historians have a clinical term for this. They call it the surplus women problem. Millions of women with no husbands, no fathers, no brothers, no sons, no one to provide income in a society where unmarried women had almost no economic opportunities. These women cleared the bombed buildings with their hands. They hauled rubble in buckets. They sorted bricks that might be reused for rebuilding. They became known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. Their pay was 72 Reichsmarks a month. Not enough to eat, not enough to live, just enough to die a little more slowly. And these were not factory workers or laborers before the war. Many of them were teachers, nurses, secretaries, musicians, women who had studied at university, who had read Goethe and Schiller, who had played Chopin on the piano in parlors that no longer existed because the parlors had been obliterated by Allied bombs. The war did not just destroy buildings, it destroyed social classes. A professor's wife and a factory worker's daughter stood side by side, passing rubble buckets. The rubble did not care about your education. Picture this: a woman who was a teacher 3 years ago, who studied literature and philosophy at university, who spoke 3 languages, who played piano. That woman is now standing in a line of other women, passing buckets of shattered concrete down a human chain, for wages that will not buy enough bread to keep her alive. Now picture a 21-year-old American private walking past that line. He has white teeth. He smells like soap, real soap, something German civilians have not seen in years. His pockets are stuffed with chocolate bars, packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and cans of Nescafe instant coffee. He has been told not to talk to these women. He has been told not to even look at them. He was never going to follow that order. Nobody was. And the military knew it. Here is the proof. The annualized venereal disease rate among American soldiers in Germany went from 50 cases per 1,000 troops at the start of the occupation to 190 per 1,000 within the first 3 months. By the end of 1945, it had exploded past 250 per 1,000, a 235% increase in 7 months. Those are not statistics about loneliness. Those are statistics about a policy that was dead on arrival. The irony: the fraternization ban actually made the VD epidemic worse. Soldiers who feared being punished for fraternizing were also afraid to visit prophylactic stations or request treatment. The Army's own regulations were driving the health crisis underground. One major with the 28th Infantry Division, William Hill, put it bluntly: soldiers are going to have their fling regardless of rules or orders. If they are caught, they know what the punishment will be. However, that is not stopping them, and nothing is going to stop them. Let me tell you about the order, because it matters. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had personally instructed General Dwight D. Eisenhower in September 1944, months before the war even ended, that the German people must have it, quote, driven home to them that the whole nation has been engaged in a lawless conspiracy against the decencies of modern civilization. That philosophy became policy. Formal, written, enforceable policy. It was called the Non-Fraternization Directive, codified in Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067. The rules were absolute. No American soldier could speak to a German adult except on official military business. No conversation, no greeting, no eye contact if it could be avoided. The penalty for violation was a $65 fine, the equivalent of a private's entire monthly salary. Soldiers caught fraternizing faced court-martial and reduction in rank. Military police patrolled the streets, the parks, the cafes, arresting any American seen talking to a German civilian. Imagine being fined a month's pay for saying "good morning" to the grandmother who cleans your barracks. That was the reality. And it lasted about 5 minutes. Well, technically it lasted a bit longer than that. But the policy began cracking almost the moment it was implemented. The reason was simple, and the generals knew it. You cannot station 1.6 million young men in a country full of young women and expect them to pretend those women do not exist, especially when those women are starving and you are throwing away food. The first official crack came on June 11th, 1945, just 5 weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th. Eisenhower modified the policy to permit soldiers to speak with German children. Within days, the streets of occupied Germany were transformed. G is teaching German kids how to play baseball. G is handing out chewing gum by the fistful. G is letting 5-year-olds sit in the driver's seat of jeeps. Think about what this looked like through the eyes of those children. For 6 years, they had been told that Americans were monsters. Now here were these smiling, laughing young men who carried seemingly endless supplies of chocolate and could not stop themselves from picking up crying toddlers. By July, soldiers were permitted to converse with German adults in public places, though entering German homes remained forbidden. The military tried to hold the line there, but by October 1st, 1945, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, abandoned the fraternization ban entirely. The only remaining prohibitions were on marriage and living in German homes. Why did the policy collapse so completely? Because reality crushed it. The U.S. military employed 300,000 Germans by December 1945. 300,000. Roughly 100,000 of those were women, working as secretaries, translators, telephone operators, clerks, cooks, and domestic workers in American installations across the occupation zone. These women worked side by side with American soldiers every single day. They typed their letters. They served their food. They washed their uniforms. The non-fraternization policy required these women to perform their duties in total silence, like ghosts. It was absurd. It was unworkable, and everyone knew it. General Lucius Clay, who served as military governor of the American zone, privately admitted what every commander on the ground already understood. Young men and young women, he said, will find each other regardless of regulations. Our choice is to channel these interactions constructively or face chaos. But here is the part that changes the story from a footnote about military policy into something much darker and much more complicated. The fraternization was not happening between equals, it was happening between conquerors and conquered, between the fed and the starving, between men who had everything and women who had nothing. And that power gap, that yawning, unbridgeable chasm between American abundance and German desperation, created an economy. Not a formal economy with banks and regulations, an underground economy, a shadow economy, an economy where a chocolate bar could buy a woman's dignity and a carton of cigarettes could buy her family's survival. Remember that calorie gap I told you about at the beginning? 4,000 versus 700? That gap was not just a number. It was a marketplace. And what was being bought and sold in that marketplace is where this story gets truly difficult to tell, but it must be told. Because what happened next, the cigarette economy, the dance halls, the desperate moral calculations that German women were forced to make every single day, that is the real story of how German women were treated by American GEs. And it is a story that most of those women never told anyone. Not their children, not their grandchildren, not anyone, until the evidence started turning up in boxes in attics decades later. But all of that, the survival economy, the forbidden romances, the impossible choices, was just the beginning. Because within months, the American occupation would produce something nobody anticipated, something the generals had no policy for, something that would force the United States government to rewrite its own immigration laws. 14,000 marriage applications, filed by German women who wanted to marry American soldiers. The question is, were those marriages love stories or survival strategies? The answer, as you are about to discover, is far more complicated than either. Part 2. The price of survival. Cigarettes, chocolate, and the economy of desperation. If you wanted to understand the real currency of occupied Germany, you did not go to a bank. You went to a train station. Specifically, you went to the coal trains, slow-moving freight trains that carried coal through the bombed-out railway corridors of the American zone. And if you stood by the tracks long enough, you would see something that captures the desperation of post-war Germany better than any statistic ever could. Women climbing onto moving trains in the dead of winter in threadbare coats, throwing coal off the cars to family members waiting below, risking death. A slip from a moving train car is not survivable. For a few lumps of coal to heat an apartment where the windows had been blown out by bombs. When American military police started guarding the trains, the women did not stop climbing. They just started offering trades to the guards in exchange for being allowed to continue. That is the world we are talking about. That is the baseline of desperation from which every interaction between American soldiers and German women must be understood. The official economy of post-war Germany was dead. The Reichsmark, Germany's currency, was essentially worthless. Not quite as worthless as it would become, we will get to the miracle that fixed it, but close. Prices were controlled by the occupation authorities, which meant that stores, when they had anything to sell at all, had to sell at government-set prices. The problem was that those prices bore no relationship to reality. A shopkeeper forced to sell bread at the official price would sell his last loaf and then have no money to buy flour to make more, so the shelves went empty. Into this vacuum stepped a new currency, American cigarettes. Think about this for a moment, because it sounds almost absurd until you realize how deadly serious it was. A single American cigarette, one Lucky Strike, one Camel, one Chesterfield, could buy a loaf of bread on the black market. A full pack could buy a week's worth of groceries. A carton, 10 packs, which cost an American soldier approximately $1 at the military post exchange, could buy a camera, a radio, a suit of clothes, family heirlooms that had survived 2 world wars, 1 carton of cigarettes, $1 for the American, 1,000 Reichsmarks for the German. Let that ratio sink in. An American private earning $50 a month could live like a king in occupied Germany. Every GI became, in effect, a millionaire simply by virtue of having access to the PX, the military store where American goods were sold at American prices. The army actually had to investigate cases where soldiers were sending home far more money than they earned. In Berlin alone, during July 1945, the Army Finance Office disbursed $1 million in pay, but soldiers sent $3 million back to addresses in America. Where did the extra $2 million come from? From the gap between what a carton of cigarettes cost at the PX and what it was worth on a German street corner. One soldier admitted it openly in a letter home. All the GI wants in Europe is a good deal, a comfortable place to sleep, food at all times, a woman to do laundry and pressing for cigarettes or candy, no army duty requiring labor, and a chance to fraternize as often as possible. In Germany, naturally, the GI finds the best deal. And what were those goods? Here is where the obscenity of the disparity becomes visceral. The PX shelves held fresh fruit, real coffee, white bread, chocolate bars, canned meat, soap, toothpaste, nylon stockings, perfume, watches, radios, all the ordinary consumer goods that Americans took for granted, but that had vanished from German life years before the war even ended. German employees who worked inside PX stores, remember 100,000 German women worked in American installations, described the experience in identical terms. It was paradise. Looking at those shelves was looking into another world. American wives buying 10 chocolate bars at a time, while German children begged for crumbs outside the window. One German woman who worked at the PX in Frankfurt recalled it years later with an image that is hard to forget. The Americans were not cruel, she said. It was just their normal life. But their normal was our impossible dream. Now here is where the story turns. Because American abundance did not just create envy. It created an entirely new social economy, one built on what soldiers had and what German women needed. The mathematics were brutal and simple. An American soldier had unlimited access to goods that were literally priceless in the German economy. A German woman had a family to feed. The transaction practically wrote itself. But before you rush to judgment, and I know some of you are already doing so, remember the context. A German mother watching her children grow thinner by the week. A woman whose husband is dead in Russia, whose brother is a prisoner in France, whose home is a bombed-out shell with newspaper taped over the windows. She is earning 72 Reichsmarks a month hauling rubble. That is not enough to buy food. It is not enough to buy anything. Then an American sergeant offers her coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Not in exchange for anything explicit, just as a kindness. Or maybe not just as a kindness. The line was never clear. It was never meant to be clear. The German women who accepted American generosity were immediately branded by their own society. The names were vicious. Ami Liebchen, American lover. Schokoladenmädchen, chocolate girl. Veronika Dankeschön, a bitter pun combining the abbreviation for venereal disease with a woman who says thank you for everything. The cruelest term needs no translation. A woman named Gertrude, who worked in an American motor pool, described the impossible trap with devastating clarity. She said, if we took American jobs, we were traitors. If we dated Americans, we were whores. If we stayed home and starved, we were fools. There was no winning. Remember that line, because it defines the experience of millions of German women in those years. No matter what they did, they were wrong. The only question was which kind of wrong they could live with. Now let me tell you about the dance halls, because this is where the transformation from desperation to something more complicated, something that began to resemble actual human connection, first took shape. By autumn 1945, social interaction between American soldiers and German women had become unstoppable. The military, having failed to prevent fraternization, decided to manage it instead. Service clubs and dance halls opened across the American zone. Theoretically, they were for American personnel only. In practice, they were filled with German women from the very first night. The pattern was the same everywhere. Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Munich, Berlin. German girls arrived in their best clothes, which often meant their only clothes. Some had altered Wehrmacht uniforms, their dead husbands' or brothers' military tunics, dyed black or brown, the only fabric available, and resewn into dresses. They had learned American dance steps from smuggled magazines, and from listening to forbidden radio broadcasts during the war. The bands were often German musicians who had secretly preserved jazz recordings throughout 12 years of Nazi rule. When American music was banned, they played Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, songs that these women knew by heart but had never been allowed to hear in public. The venues had names that still carry echoes of that era. The Femina Palace in Frankfurt, the Haus Vaterland in Berlin, the America House locations that sprouted up in every major city. These were not dimly lit nightclubs. They were, in many cases, the only heated buildings in neighborhoods where every other structure was a bombed-out shell. Women came for the warmth as much as the music. They came because the alternative was sitting in a freezing apartment, in the dark, hungry. The dance halls offered light, heat, sound, and for a few hours, the illusion that life might someday be normal again. An American corporal from Detroit wrote home about the experience, and his letter survived. "The German girls are desperate to dance," he wrote. "They have been forbidden from dancing to American music for 12 years. They know every word to songs they have never been allowed to hear. It is heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. But the dance halls were more than entertainment. They were survival markets. Military police reports from the period documented the exchange rates with bureaucratic precision. One dance might earn a woman a chocolate bar. An evening of companionship might yield coffee and cigarettes, enough to feed a family for several days. A steady relationship with an American soldier could mean the difference between life and death for an entire household. One woman, who later married her American soldier and moved to the United States, described the atmosphere at a Frankfurt dance hall in 1946 with an honesty that is painful to read. "We pretended it was about the music and the dancing," she said, "but everyone knew the truth. Girls without families to feed danced for joy. Girls with hungry siblings danced for food. The Americans knew it, too. But what could anyone do? It was the reality we lived in." Now, I need to stop here for a moment and say something important. Because the easy narrative, the Hollywood version, is to cast American soldiers as either white knights rescuing damsels in distress or as predators exploiting vulnerable women. The truth is that they were neither, or rather they were both, depending on the individual, depending on the day, depending on the specific circumstances of each encounter. There were soldiers who shared food with German families out of genuine compassion and expected nothing in return. There were soldiers who exploited the power imbalance for the worst reasons imaginable. Most fell somewhere in the vast grey area between those two extremes. They were young men, far from home, lonely, bored, stationed in a foreign country full of grateful women. The situation practically manufactured relationships, some genuine, some transactional, and many that were both at the same time. And then there was the food destruction policy. This is something that most people have never heard about, and it changes the moral equation in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. American mess halls were ordered to pour bleach on leftover food so that Germans could not eat it. The rationale was partly logistical, preventing Germans from becoming dependent on military scraps, and partly punitive. Remember, JCS 1067 was still technically in force. Germany was to be treated as a defeated enemy nation. One American sergeant from Philadelphia documented what this looked like in practice. He wrote, "We are ordered to pour bleach on leftover food so Germans cannot eat it. It is horrible. Children watching us destroy food while they are starving. Most of us ignore the order when officers are not looking." Read that again. American soldiers, the same soldiers who were forbidden from speaking to Germans, were secretly saving leftover food and passing it to German families in defiance of their own orders. They were breaking the rules in both directions. The fraternization ban told them not to help, and the food destruction policy told them to waste. Most chose to ignore both. The women who worked directly for the American military had an advantage over other German women, and they knew it. Their salaries were higher, roughly 200 Reichsmarks per month compared to the 72 that rubble women earned. But the real compensation was not the salary, it was access. A German woman named Anna, who worked as a translator at Campbell Barracks in Heidelberg, explained it in terms that make you want to set down whatever you are eating. "My American salary was 200 Reichsmarks. she said, but the real payment was leftovers from the officers' mess. One day's scraps could feed my mother, my grandmother, and my 2 younger brothers for a week. The other German girls and I would carefully wrap every piece of bread, every half-eaten apple, to take home. She was not describing corruption. She was describing survival. And every German woman who worked in an American installation did exactly the same thing. But survival came with a price, not a financial price, a social one. Women who worked for Americans were ostracized by their communities. The names I mentioned earlier, chocolate girl, Ami lover, were applied not just to women who dated Americans, but to any woman who accepted employment from them. In a society that had just lost a war, any cooperation with the occupier was viewed as collaboration, and the punishment for collaboration was social death. Think about the cruelty of that position. You are a woman with a family to feed. The only jobs that pay enough to keep your family alive are jobs working for the Americans. If you take the job, your neighbors will call you a traitor. If you refuse the job, your children may starve. What would you do? Millions of German women answered that question the only way they could. They took the jobs. They endured the insults. They wrapped the leftover bread in napkins and carried it home in their pockets, and they kept their mouths shut. But there was another force at work in occupied Germany that went beyond survival calculations. Something that surprised everyone. The military, the policymakers, the Germans themselves. People fell in love. Despite the regulations, despite the social stigma, despite the fact that fraternization with the enemy was technically a crime on both sides. American soldiers risked court-martial, German women risked ostracism. Despite all of that, thousands and thousands of genuine romantic relationships formed between American men and German women, and the United States military had absolutely no idea what to do about it, because there was a problem, a big one. Even after the fraternization ban was lifted in October 1945, one prohibition remained firmly in place. American soldiers were forbidden, completely, totally, absolutely forbidden, from marrying German women, which meant that by the winter of 1945, occupied Germany was home to thousands of couples who were in love, living together illegally, many of them expecting children, and the law said their relationships did not exist. Some soldiers obtained forged documents claiming their German girlfriends were displaced persons from Poland or France. Others arranged proxy marriages through lawyers back in the States. Many simply lived together in secret, knowing that discovery meant court-martial for the soldier and disgrace for the woman. The pressure for change came from a source no one expected: military chaplains. These were the men who had initially opposed German-American relationships most vehemently. Ministers, priests, and rabbis who saw fraternization as moral failure. But month after month, these same chaplains found themselves counseling couples who were clearly, unmistakably in love. They married these men before combat. They buried them after. And now they were watching these same men being told they could not marry the women they loved. One military chaplain wrote an official report that would eventually help change policy. He said, "These are not war trophies or conquests. I have married these men before combat and buried them after. They deserve the right to choose their own wives." The marriage ban would not fall until December 1946, more than a year and a half after the war ended. And when it did fall, what happened next was unlike anything the American military bureaucracy had ever experienced. But before we get there, before the avalanche of marriage applications and the boats crossing the Atlantic, there is something else happening in occupied Germany that you need to understand, something that was transforming the entire dynamic between Americans and Germans far beyond individual romances. The currency was dying, the economy was collapsing, and the hunger was about to get much, much worse, because the winter of 1946 to 47 was coming. The Germans would call it the hunger winter, and what happened during those frozen months would push the relationship between American soldiers and German women past a breaking point that nobody, not Eisenhower, not Truman, not anyone, had anticipated. Remember the calorie gap, 4,000 versus 700? That gap was about to become the difference between life and death, literally. Part 3. The breaking point. Hunger winter forbidden marriages, and the voyage to America. The winter of 1946 to 1947 entered German memory under a single name: Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. Temperatures plunged to -25 degrees Celsius. Coal supplies, already inadequate, ran out entirely in many cities. Rivers froze, trapping supply barges in the harbors. The harvest the previous autumn had been catastrophic, meaning fresh food from Germany's own farmland was almost non-existent, and the rations, already inadequate, were cut again. Picture this. You are a mother in Essen, in the industrial Ruhr Valley. Your apartment has no heat. The windows are covered with cardboard because the glass was blown out in a bombing raid 2 years ago. It is -20 outside and not much warmer inside. Your children are wearing every piece of clothing they own, layered on top of each other, because there are no blankets left, and the food office has just informed you that your daily ration has been reduced to approximately 700 calories. 700 calories is not a diet. It is not even a fast. It is slow starvation. It is your body consuming its own muscle tissue because there is nothing else to consume. It is your children becoming so weak that they cannot walk to school. Not that the schools are heated either. Germans called the cold the White Death. It killed the elderly in their beds. It killed infants who could not generate enough body heat to survive the night. It killed people who were already so weakened by months of malnutrition that a common cold became a death sentence. How many people died during the Hunger Winter? We will never know the exact number. German civil administration was in shambles. Death certificates were not always filed. Bodies were sometimes not found until spring. What we know is that the death rate in occupied Germany during this period was roughly double the pre-war figure. Tuberculosis cases surged. Suicide rates spiked. In Hamburg alone, there were an estimated 10,000 cases of acute starvation. A German Red Cross report from January 1947 described conditions in language that belongs in a war zone, not a European city, 12 months after peace had been declared. Children arriving at schools too weak to hold pencils. Elderly people found frozen in their beds, not from the cold alone, but because malnutrition had robbed their bodies of the ability to generate heat. Hospitals running out of everything: bandages, antiseptic, anesthesia, while American military hospitals a few blocks away had supplies stacked to the ceiling. An American quartermaster colonel was quoted saying that the ration of 1,425 calories being provided to German civilians was roughly equivalent to a hearty American breakfast. One meal. That was what German adults were expected to survive on for an entire day. And here is the detail that sears itself into your brain. While German civilians were dying from hunger and cold, American soldiers stationed in the same cities were still receiving their 4,000 calories a day, still throwing away leftover food, still shopping at PX stores stocked with goods that German families would have killed for, literally killed for. The Hunger Winter did something to German-American relationships that no policy or regulation ever could. It erased whatever remaining pride German women had left. It turned every survival instinct up to maximum, and it made relationships with American soldiers, relationships that had previously been a matter of choice, however constrained, into matters of life and death. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor, understood this better than most. In a communication to Washington, he issued a warning that has become one of the most quoted lines in occupation history. He said, "There is no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories." Clay was talking about politics, but the same logic applied to every personal decision German women were making that winter. There is no choice between feeding your children and preserving your reputation. There is no choice between survival and dignity when survival is the only option left. And then, into this frozen hell, came a date that changed everything. December 11th, 1946. That was the day the American military lifted the ban on marriages between American soldiers and German women. The effect was immediate, instantaneous. Within 24 hours, one single day, military officers across the American zone received 2,500 marriage applications. By January 1947, that number had risen to 7,000. Think about what that means. 7,000 couples who had been living in limbo, some for more than a year, finally had the chance to make their relationships legal. 7,000 American soldiers who had fallen in love with German women, despite every regulation, every social pressure, and every order telling them not to. 7,000 German women who were willing to leave their country, their language, their families, and everything they had ever known to cross an ocean with men they had met during the worst period of their lives. But it was not as simple as signing a piece of paper. Not even close. German women who wanted to marry Americans faced an investigation that was designed to be humiliating. Political background checks for Nazi connections, not just the woman, but her parents, her siblings, her extended family, medical examinations, character references, proof that the relationship was motivated by, quote, sincere affection rather than economic calculation. Think about the absurdity of that last requirement. Prove that you love this man and are not marrying him to escape starvation. How exactly do you prove such a thing? How do you separate love from desperation when you are living through both at the same time? When the man who brought you chocolate is also the man who makes you laugh? When the soldier who keeps your family alive is also the person you want to spend your life with? The process required a minimum of 15 different documents, 3 medical examinations, and interviews with military intelligence officers. The average wait time between applying and actually getting married was 3 months. Many couples waited much longer. One German woman who married an American sergeant in 1947 described the experience in testimony that captures the institutional humiliation perfectly. They asked if I was a Nazi, she said, if my parents were Nazis, if I had dated German soldiers, if I was marrying for money, if I was pregnant. They examined my entire life like I was a criminal. My husband was furious, but I told him it was worth it to be together, and it was worth it, because marriage to an American was, for many German women, the only path out of a country that had nothing left to offer them. Not just economically, though that was part of it, but also psychologically, emotionally. These were women who had survived bombing raids, who had buried family members in rubble, who had lived through the total collapse of everything they knew. Germany in 1946 was not a place that offered hope. It was a place that offered rubble, hunger, and shame. America, or at least the idea of America as represented by these smiling, well-fed, impossibly generous soldiers, offered something else. A future, a fresh start, a place where no one would call you a rubble woman or a chocolate girl. But first, they had to get there. The War Brides Act, passed by the United States Congress on December 28, 1945, was supposed to make it easier for foreign wives of American soldiers to immigrate. But here is the catch that most people do not know about. The original War Brides Act specifically excluded German and Japanese women. The wives of former enemies were not welcome. It took 2 additional amendments, one in 1946 and another in 1947, before German war brides could legally enter the United States. Even then, the process was agonizing. The average wait between marriage and permission to immigrate was 8 months. 8 months of uncertainty. 8 months of wondering if the paperwork would come through. 8 months during which many women were separated from their husbands, who had been reassigned or sent home while the bureaucracy ground forward. The first groups of German war brides departed from the port of Bremerhaven on converted troop transport ships. These were not luxury liners. They were military vessels with bare-bones accommodations designed to move soldiers, not families. Cabins designed for 4 held 6 or 8 women. Children were separated into nurseries. Many of the women were pregnant. Military regulations required pregnant women to travel before their 7th month or wait until after delivery. The voyage across the Atlantic took roughly 2 weeks. 2 weeks of seasickness, anxiety, and improvised English lessons. The women taught each other useful phrases. "Thank you for having me. I am pleased to meet you. I will be a good wife." They practiced these sentences over and over, terrified of making mistakes in the country where they would spend the rest of their lives. One woman kept a diary of her crossing. On the first day, she wrote that she was seasick and terrified. The American Red Cross volunteers on board were kind, she said, but other passengers avoided the German women when they heard their accents. One woman spat at her when she learned she was German. On the last day of the voyage, she saw the Statue of Liberty. She wrote that she cried for an hour. She did not know if the tears were from joy or fear. And then America. Many war brides discovered that their husbands had exaggerated their circumstances. The rich businessman turned out to be a gas station attendant. The big farm in Iowa turned out to be a rented room above a garage. Some husbands had families who refused to accept their German daughters-in-law. Some husbands, it turned out, had wives they had never divorced. In states with large German-American populations, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, integration was somewhat easier. There were existing German communities, German churches, German social clubs, where a war bride could find familiar language and customs. But in small towns where anti-German sentiment still ran high, war brides faced hostility that was sometimes worse than what they had endured in occupied Germany. One woman arrived in Alabama in 1947. Her husband's family refused to meet her for 6 months. The neighbors called her Nazi when she walked to the grocery store. The grocer would not serve her until other customers complained. Her husband defended her, but he worked long hours. She said she cried every day for a year. But this woman, and thousands like her, did something remarkable. She adapted. She learned to cook Southern food alongside her German recipes. She joined the local church. She volunteered for every school event. She was so relentlessly, aggressively perfect in her Americanness that the neighbors eventually forgot to be suspicious. 20 years later, she was president of her local PTA. 30 years later, her daughter became a translator for the State Department. That trajectory, from despised foreigner to community pillar, was repeated in thousands of small towns across America. German war brides often possessed education and skills that eventually won respect. Many spoke multiple languages, understood classical music, and had studied literature and philosophy at the gymnasium level. School districts discovered that these women made excellent language teachers. By 1960, hundreds of former war brides were teaching in American schools, and yet, despite the humiliation of the vetting process, despite the terror of the ocean crossing, despite the hostility they encountered in America, the overwhelming majority of these marriages survived. Military records from the period tell a remarkable story. Marriages between American soldiers and German women formed after the 1948 currency reform, which we are about to discuss, showed only a 15% divorce rate within 5 years. For comparison, the average American divorce rate during the same period was higher, and 70% of all German-American marriages during the occupation lasted more than 20 years. How? Why? Because something extraordinary was about to happen in Germany. Something that would transform the relationship between American soldiers and German women more completely than any regulation, any dance hall, any marriage certificate ever could. And it would happen in a single weekend. The date is June 20th, 1948. And what took place on that day was not a battle, not a treaty, and not a love story. It was something much simpler and much more powerful. It was the death of a worthless currency and the birth of a miracle. And it changed absolutely everything. Part 4. The Miracle Weekend, the Forgotten Children, and the Woman Who Saved 500. June 19th, 1948. A Saturday. A woman we will call Margot is lying awake in the apartment she shares with her mother and younger sister in Frankfurt. She is 24 years old. She has been dating an American officer for 5 months. He is kind. He is respectful. He brings food for her family every time he visits. Her mother likes him. Her sister adores him. But Margot is not in love with him. She knows this. He probably knows it too. She is with him because his leftovers from the officer's mess are the only thing keeping her family from starving. She has been considering for weeks, whether to sleep with him. Not because she wants to, because he has hinted gently that their relationship might deepen. And a deeper relationship would mean more food, steadier access to the PX, maybe, eventually, marriage and a ticket to America. She is 24 years old, and she is lying in the dark, calculating the exchange rate of her body for her family's survival. This is Saturday, June 19th, 1948. Now let me tell you what happened on Monday, June 21st. The currency reform. It had been planned in secrecy for months. A team of German financial experts had been sequestered in military barracks in Rothwestern, near Kassel, under the direction of a 26-year-old American economist named Edward Tenenbaum. They were not allowed to make phone calls. Their mail was censored. They worked around the clock to design a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, that would replace the worthless Reichsmark. On Sunday, June 20th, the new currency was announced by radio. On Monday, it was distributed. Every German citizen received 40 Deutsche Marks, roughly $10 American, as their initial allotment, with another 20 marks to follow. 40 marks. That was it. That was the starting point of a new economic life for 80 million people. But the effect was immediate and astonishing. It was, by all accounts, one of the most dramatic economic transformations in recorded history. On Friday, the shop windows were empty. On Monday, they were full. Goods appeared, as if by magic. Shopkeepers who had been hoarding merchandise, hiding it from the official economy, because selling at government prices meant selling at a loss, suddenly brought everything out. Food, clothing, tools, household goods. The shelves that had been bare for 3 years were suddenly stocked. The black market evaporated overnight. Cigarettes went from being currency to being what they actually were, something you smoked after dinner. The Reichsmark, the currency that had governed every desperate transaction, every survival calculation, every dance hall exchange for 3 years, ceased to exist, and the effect on relationships between American soldiers and German women was revolutionary. One German woman described the change with a clarity that needs no embellishment. Saturday, June 19th, she said, I was considering becoming an officer's mistress to keep my family alive. Monday, June 21st, I had a real job at real wages. The desperation disappeared overnight. Suddenly we could choose relationships for love, not food. American soldiers noticed the change immediately. One sergeant wrote home in July 1948. The German girls changed overnight. Before they would date anyone for chocolate. Now they are selective. A private with no prospects gets ignored. They want sincere relationships, not meal tickets. Think about what this means. In a single weekend, the fundamental power dynamic of the American occupation was transformed. Before the currency reform, German women were dependent on American soldiers for survival. After the reform, they were independent economic actors who could earn, save, and spend on their own terms. The playing field was not yet level. Germany was still a long way from recovery, but it was no longer a cliff. Restaurants reopened, accepting Deutsche Marks instead of cigarettes. Movie theaters showed films for cash instead of barter. Dance halls operated commercially. For the first time since the end of the war, a German woman could go on a date with an American soldier and pay for her own coffee. And this is the key to understanding why the marriages formed after the currency reform were so much more durable than the ones formed before. Pre-reform marriages showed a 30% divorce rate within 5 years. Post-reform marriages showed only 15%. The reason was simple. When women had the economic freedom to choose, they chose better. When desperation was removed from the equation, what remained was genuine connection. The Margot I told you about? Lying awake on June 19th, calculating the price of survival? She broke up with the American officer the following week. She got a job at a rebuilt department store. She earned enough to feed her family. 2 years later, she met a different American, a military engineer stationed in Frankfurt, and this time, she fell in love for real. They married in 1951 and moved to Ohio. They were together for 43 years, but the currency reform brought something else into sharp focus. Something that had been happening throughout the occupation, but that Germany had, for the most part, been able to ignore. The children. By various estimates, roughly 37,000 children were born to German mothers and American fathers during the occupation period. Let that number settle. 37,000. Most of these children were born out of wedlock. Most of their fathers were transferred to other postings, or shipped home to America without ever knowing they had fathered a child. The children whose parents married, whose American fathers acknowledged them, whose families were intact, generally fared well. They gained American citizenship, and many immigrated to the United States with their mothers. Their stories, while difficult, at least had structure and support. But the majority did not have married parents. The majority were raised by their German mothers alone, in a society that had very specific ideas about illegitimate children and very unforgiving attitudes toward women who had slept with the enemy. These children were called Besatzungskinder, occupation children. They grew up in a country that did not quite know what to do with them. Their mothers were stigmatized. Their fathers were ghosts, men whose names might be Bill or John or Robert, men who drove jeeps and handed out chocolate and then disappeared forever. Many of these children grew up not knowing who their fathers were. Their mothers kept the secret, sometimes for decades. They told neighbors the father had died in the war. They told their children stories that were partly true and partly fiction. The silence was a survival mechanism in a society that punished women for sleeping with the occupier. Admitting you had an American child was social suicide. One man, born in 1947, told his story decades later. He said his mother told everyone his father had died in the war, but his features, lighter hair, a different bone structure, marked him as different. Kids called him Ami Bastard at school. Teachers ignored the bullying. No apprenticeship would accept him. It was not until he immigrated to America in 1968 to find his father that he finally escaped the stigma. But there was a group of occupation children whose suffering was worse, immeasurably worse, than the white children of white American soldiers. And telling their story requires confronting an ugliness that post-war Germany would have preferred to keep hidden. Approximately 5,000 children were born to German mothers and African American fathers. In a country that had spent 12 years under Nazi racial ideology, 12 years of being taught that racial mixing was the ultimate biological crime, these children were treated as abominations. They were called Negermischling, a term too ugly to translate precisely, but it means what you think it means. Teachers seated them separately from white children. Parents forbade their children from playing with them. Employers refused to hire their mothers when they discovered the child's existence. Some mothers, crushed by the stigma, placed their mixed-race children in orphanages. They told themselves it was temporary, that someone would adopt the child, that America would come for them. The West German film Toxie, released in 1952, brought national attention to the plight of these children. The film told the story of a mixed-race occupation child left on a doorstep. It was a commercial hit, one of the most successful German films of the year, but historians note that it framed the child as a problem requiring a solution, rather than a citizen deserving acceptance. The film's happy ending involved the child being taken to America. The message was clear. Germany did not have room for these children. America would have to take them. And in one remarkable case, America did come, but not through any government program. Through one woman. Her name was Mabel Grammer. Grammer was an African-American journalist from Arkansas, married to an army officer stationed in Mannheim, Germany. She could not have children of her own. Childhood illness had left her infertile. When she visited the orphanages near Mannheim and saw the mixed-race German children, children that no German family would adopt, children that the German welfare system had essentially given up on, she decided to act. She and her husband adopted 12 of these children themselves. 12, but she did not stop there. She created what became known as the Brown Baby Plan. Working through her contacts at the African-American newspaper, The Afro-American, she published photographs of the children, wrote articles about their plight, and actively recruited African-American families in the United States to adopt them. She arranged for Scandinavian Airlines to fly the children across the Atlantic. She cut through bureaucratic red tape that would have stalled official channels for years. By the time Grammer's work was done, approximately 500 mixed-race German children had been placed with African-American families in the United States. 500 children who would otherwise have grown up as outcasts in a country that did not want them. Think about that. One woman, no government funding, No official mandate, just a conviction that these children deserved better than what Germany was offering them, and 500 lives saved because of it. Was the Brown Baby Plan perfect? No. Critics, including some civil rights organizations, argued that African American children in the Jim Crow South had a greater need for assistance than half-white children overseas. The German government eventually objected to the program for different reasons, and many of the adopted children struggled with identity issues that would take decades to resolve. But 500 children got a chance, and that matters. The story of the occupation children, both white and mixed race, is one of the least told chapters of the American occupation of Germany. It is a story of 37,000 human beings who were, in a very real sense, the physical evidence of everything that happened between American soldiers and German women, evidence of love, of desperation, of loneliness, of exploitation, of genuine human connection, and of abandonment, all at once, all tangled together in ways that can never be fully sorted out. And those children, the ones who survived, who grew up, who found their way in the world, many of them eventually became something that neither America nor Germany had anticipated. Bridges, living, breathing bridges between two countries that had been trying to kill each other just years before. They spoke two languages, they understood two cultures, they carried two identities, and when the Cold War turned Germany from enemy to ally, these bicultural children, now young adults, became some of the most valuable assets either country had. But all of that came later. In 1948 and 1949, they were still just children, growing up in the rubble of their mothers' choices. And those mothers, the 14,000 who crossed the ocean, the hundreds of thousands who stayed behind, the millions who simply endured, their story was not over yet. Because the final chapter of the American occupation of Germany is not about war or hunger or survival. It is about what happens when former enemies stop being enemies and start being neighbors, when the power dynamic shifts from occupier and occupied to something approaching partnership, when the women who cleared rubble for starvation wages begin shopping at department stores with real money in their pockets, and when the soldiers who once handed out chocolate begin to realize that the women they married are, in many ways, tougher, smarter, and more resilient than they will ever be. The final act of this story is about transformation, and it begins with a reunion that took place 50 years later in a hotel ballroom in Washington, D.C. Part 5 plus verdict. Legacy. From Rubble Women to Bridge Builders. 1995. Washington, D.C. A hotel ballroom. 500 women, all of them now in their 60s and 70s, many of them grandmothers, have gathered for what the organizers are calling the largest reunion of German war brides in American history. They have come from every state, from cities with large German-American communities, and from small towns where they spent decades as the only German for miles. These are the women, the ones who climbed onto troop transports in Bremerhaven with cardboard suitcases and half-memorized English phrases, the ones who arrived in America to discover that their husbands' big farms were rented apartments and that their new neighbors called them Nazis, the ones who reinvented themselves completely, totally from the ground up, in a country that was not sure it wanted them. They have not talked about their experiences, not in decades, not to their children, not to their friends. The silence was a survival strategy, just as it had been in occupied Germany. In America, being German was something you hid. You cooked American food. You spoke English without an accent. You joined the PTA, volunteered at church, and never, ever mentioned where you came from. But now, 50 years later, in a ballroom full of women who share the same story, the silence breaks. And the woman who speaks at the podium, the keynote speaker, the one whose words will be remembered, is the same woman whose journal opened this story. The 23-year-old who watched Americans enter Heidelberg on Good Friday, 1945, and wrote, "The Americans are nothing like what they told us." She is now 73. She married an American soldier from Iowa. She raised 3 children. Her daughter became a translator for the State Department. Her son became an army officer who, in one of history's more poetic symmetries, was stationed in Germany. She stands at that podium, and she says something that captures the entire experience of 20,000 women in a few sentences that deserve to be preserved exactly as they were spoken. We were young women at history's crossroads, defeated but not broken, desperate but not degraded. We chose love over hate, hope over despair, future over past. She paused. They called us opportunists, traitors. Worse, we were none of those things. We were survivors who became builders. Our marriages built bridges. Our children became citizens of the world. Our lives proved that enemies need not remain enemies. Another pause. To our daughters and granddaughters, we gave you a dual heritage, not as a burden, but as a blessing. You carry both German and American traditions. You understand that patriotism does not require hatred of others. You know that love transcends borders. And then she said something that silenced the entire room. To those who judge us, walk in our shoes. Face starvation, bombardment, and occupation. Choose between collaboration and hunger. Then judge whether trading companionship for chocolate was sin or survival. The ballroom gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. American husbands stood beside German wives. Bicultural children stood beside their aging mothers. And 500 women who had spent 50 years in silence finally heard someone say out loud what they had all been carrying inside. So, here we are, at the verdict. What happened between American soldiers and German women in the decade after World War II? It was not a love story. Not exactly. It was something more complicated than that, and more important. It was the collision of the most powerful military force on Earth with the most desperate civilian population in modern European history. It was an experiment in human nature conducted at scale. 1.6 million men, millions of women, all thrown together in the ruins of a civilization that had tried to destroy itself. And the results of that experiment are not simple. They are not clean. They do not fit into a Hollywood movie or a textbook paragraph. Here is what the numbers tell us. 14,000 to 20,000 German women married American servicemen between 1946 and 1955. The majority of those marriages lasted. The children of those marriages, the second generation, became translators, diplomats, military officers, teachers, business people. They served in the Cold War. They built careers that spanned continents. They proved, simply by existing, that former enemies could become family. 37,000 children were born to German mothers and American fathers. Most of those children grew up without knowing their fathers. Many were stigmatized, ostracized, marked for life by the circumstances of their birth. The 5,000 mixed-race children among them suffered discrimination that was, in some cases, barely distinguishable from the racial ideology of the regime that had just been defeated. 300,000 German women worked for the American military, earning wages and access to goods that kept their families alive during the most desperate years of the occupation. They were called collaborators by their neighbors and saviors by their children, and approximately 500 mixed-race orphans were given a chance at life by one woman with a newspaper column and an unshakable belief that every child deserves a home. These numbers are not the whole story. They never are. Behind each number is a woman who made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances. A woman who weighed hunger against dignity, fear against hope, shame against survival, and chose whatever allowed her to live one more day. Were they treated well? Some were. Some were treated with extraordinary kindness and genuine love. Were they treated badly? Some were. Some were exploited, abandoned, and left to raise children alone in a society that punished them for their choices. Most experienced both. Most lived in that vast, uncomfortable, morally ambiguous territory where good and bad exist simultaneously, where a chocolate bar can be both a gift and a transaction, where a marriage can be both a love story and an escape route. The American occupation of Germany was, by most historical assessments, one of the most successful military occupations in human history. Germany was transformed from a destroyed dictatorship into a prosperous democracy within a single generation. And while that transformation had many causes, the Marshall Plan, the currency reform, the Cold War, one cause that is almost never mentioned is the human one. The personal connections, the marriages, the families, the children, the individual acts of kindness and courage and compromise that accumulated over a decade into something that looked remarkably like reconciliation. Think about the contrast with the Soviet zone. Soviet soldiers also formed relationships with German women, but Soviet policy never permitted marriage. There was no pathway from encounter to family, no legal framework for love. The result was a different kind of legacy, one built on trauma and secrecy rather than connection. The American zone's evolution from prohibition to grudging acceptance to actual support created something the Soviet zone never could. Enduring bonds between individuals that made political alliance feel natural rather than imposed. The women who cleared rubble in 1945 for 72 Reichsmarks a month were, by 1955, shopping at department stores with Deutsche Marks in their wallets. The women who traded companionship for chocolate were choosing husbands based on love, not survival. The women who had been branded as traitors for working with Americans now saw German-American friendship as official national policy. The personal became the political. The individual became the historical. The woman who accepted a chocolate bar from a lonely soldier in March 1945 helped build a bridge between two nations that politicians and generals could not construct. And the fountain pen that recorded Ingrid's first impression of Americans, "They are nothing like what they told us," would eventually write letters from Iowa, describing a new life in a country she once feared, describing children who spoke two languages, describing grandchildren who saw no contradiction in being both German and American. The transformation was complete. The conquered had become family. The occupied had become citizens. The enemies had become the closest of allies. That transformation, replicated in 14,000 marriages, in 37,000 children, in millions of individual encounters, changed the course of history. Not in parliaments, not in treaties, not in military operations, in dance halls and mess kitchens, in whispered conversations and carefully wrapped pieces of bread, in the simple, human moments when former enemies looked at each other and saw not a nationality, but a person. The children of those marriages, the second generation, became something neither country had planned for. They enlisted in the military at higher rates than average Americans, often requesting German assignments. They became translators for the State Department, officers who understood German culture from the inside, diplomats who could navigate between Washington and Bonn as naturally as breathing. During the Cold War, when the border between East and West Germany became the most dangerous line on Earth, these bicultural Americans were some of the most valuable assets the United States had. Lieutenant colonels whose mothers had taught them German lullabies, CIA analysts who understood the German psyche because they had grown up with it at the dinner table, corporate executives who opened German markets for American companies because they could negotiate in two languages and two cultures simultaneously. They were, in the truest sense, living proof that the occupation had worked, not because of policy directives or Marshall Plan dollars, but because their parents, a lonely GI from Iowa and a hungry woman from Frankfurt, had looked past everything that divided them and built a family. The German women who lived through the American occupation did not just witness history, they transformed it through countless individual acts of courage, compromise, and connection. And their legacy, alive in every family that spans the Atlantic, in every bilingual grandchild, in every moment when former enemies meet as friends, is proof that even in the ruins of the worst destruction humanity has ever inflicted on itself, it is possible to build something that lasts. Not just buildings, but bonds. Not just cities, but families. Not just peace, but love, however complicated its origins. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Not because the algorithm demands it, though it does, but because the next chapter of this story, the one about how Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, is just as extraordinary as the one about how it fell, and the women who lived through both deserve to have their story told. I will see you in the next one.